All right, good evening, everybody. Good to have you back in class tonight. Welcome to Bible school again. I do hope you have your textbook with you, and we're going to be looking at the last chapter now. We're beginning the last group in this book. We've been talking about discussing denominational differences. Shame I have several other slides pulled up just now. Let me cut back on some of those. And the reading assignment, if you did it, remember tonight when you give the attendance code, you have an opportunity to say yes or no in that Google form. So please let us know if you did the reading. Next week's reading assignment, pages 391 to 415. By the grace of God, we're going to be covering a couple more points as it pertains to atheism. We're going to talk about the problem of evil and the futility of theism, let's say the accusations against theism. And so that'll be next week. We're going to take our time in this last section because, especially like tonight's topic, we're going to be dealing with Darwinian evolution. These are not, God called me to preach, not to be a scientist. So admittedly, I have to take my time and do my homework. And this stuff is, I don't want to say it's above my head, but it's certainly not something I talk about all the time. I can follow the discussions pretty well. When I read the books, I think I have a firm grasp of it. But it's one thing to follow the discussion, and it's another thing to lead the discussion. So admittedly, like I said, I'm a preacher, not a scientist. That being said, preachers can understand science, and scientists can understand preaching and biblical things. So it's not as if God's called you to one, you can't have any grasp of the other. But before we go any further, let's stop and have a word of prayer, and then we'll jump into this lesson tonight. Father, thank you for the privilege of having this time together. Please use this time to better prepare us to minister to those around us. And as the end times approach and time passes more and more, we find this idea of atheism and agnosticism becoming more and more trendy, popular. And God, you know the hearts of these people and why they choose to believe one thing or the other. So God, help us to have the patience and the concern and the compassion to patiently minister to those around us. Equip us with the necessary knowledge. And we ask it all in Jesus' name and for his sake. Amen. Amen. All right, guys, before we get into the text tonight, I want to mention just real quick this thing I've put below me, discussion or division. And as you know, the title of this book, Discussing Denominational Differences. I've listed out a few of the things that differentiate what we would maybe classify as Bible-believing Christianity. Obviously, that term is going to be a bit fluid depending on who's using it. But what makes these various groups stand out? What makes them different from just the basic fundamental evangelical Christian? Now, I want to, this is going to be a bit of a blanket statement here, but as I've mentioned underneath, all things are worthy of a well-intentioned, thoughtful, and honest discussion. Please never be afraid to say, let's chat about this. Let's talk about this. Let's work through our differences. If both people approach it with the right attitude, then everything is worthy of a discussion. Anything, right? You can always stand to learn something. Even if you're not convinced by the arguments that they give, you at least have heard them out. And now you can say, I have given that position a fair chance. And that's what we would hope people, that's what we hope from them. So I think discussion is always on the table. Now, not all things are worthy of division. You're going to have some discussions, and at the end of the discussion, you're not going to see eye to eye. It doesn't mean you have to divide, separate, avoid that person. And now listen, I'm talking Christians, right? Christian to Christian. Some of these denominational differences, not worth dividing over. We as Bible-believing people are often way too picky, way too sensitive, right? Things that are not emphasized in the New Testament, we tend to put quite a bit of pressure on those things. And I must admit, when I was a younger Christian, there were a lot more things that I would consider fundamental and division worthy. And as time has gone on, you might hear this and go, yeah, pastor's, compromising and trying to accommodate. I've changed my mind on a few things, but not so that I could get more church members or, please a certain crowd or become more popular. As time has gone on, I want to say I've grown. I'd like to think that the Lord has shown me that these things are important and these things just not as important. Some things are not worth dividing over. Paul said in Romans chapter 16, mark them, which cause divisions, contrary to the doctrine which you have learned, and avoid them. So when it comes to something black and white, there it is in the Bible. It's a clear doctrine. Now that if it's going to disturb and interfere with the fellowship that we can have and getting the gospel across to people, then yes, if it's a matter of salvation, those are big things. But preferences like what music you like to listen to, or what social events you have in the church, those type of things, do we really need to divide over that? So just wanted to point that out. Please, I think it would be beneficial if we did have more scriptural/spiritual discussions amongst ourselves with other people. It's too bad that we're not all open to that and approach that patiently, calmly, with the right intentions, and then not seek for a reason to divide. We are to seek after peace. We are to be peacemakers. And I get it. Sometimes the division the problem is so big you need to put some separation. But we certainly shouldn't be going into the conversation looking for a way to get to get away from that person. All right. So just wanted to point that out. And now let's talk about atheism. I'm not going to cover the key figures as I mentioned in the book. I hope you did the reading. The list could go on and on. I mean, there is no official website you go to for atheism, right? There is no book that lists out their history precisely. So it's a bit tough to narrow that down, but I did try to give you some of the key figures that you might come across if you ever do read up on this. And I gave you their key moments, the history. I don't always do this. I didn't do this with the other groups. Tonight I'm going to give you a quick run through the overview of atheism's history. And guys, this is not all the details, right? Just giving you kind of some of the, can I say, high points or main points in the history. So many people will say that a guy named Diagoras, they call him Diagoras the atheist, but that's really a misnomer. That's not a good name for him because there's really nothing in his writings. He was a Greek poet, lived back in the 400s BC, and he apparently did not agree with Greek mythology. But he didn't come out and make any statements that would be similar to what we hear from atheists today. So to call him Diagoras the atheist, you really have to understand the context in which that title or that nickname was given to him. And if you go to like Wikipedia or something, they will say he's the first atheist, or people sometimes will say that. But that was the 400s BC, 5th century BC. All the way back into the 9th or 10th century BC. We're back in the writings of David. And I've given you the verse here, Psalm 14, verse 1, which, by the way, is your attendance code. David wrote this, "The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable works. There is none that doeth good." So David's observation was there were people in this world that did not believe in God. So atheism is and obviously, as long as there has been humanity, and let's say fallen humanity, there's been the opportunity for unbelief, or maybe disbelief would be a better word. So who's to know exactly how old atheism is? I think a good guess would be just a few hundred years after theism, right? After Adam and Eve, you have the possibility for atheism to come in. Now, I also point out in the book the term agnostic, which is simply somebody who hasn't decided. I'm not going to get deep into that. That's more just so you understand what that term means. But somebody who's not quite sure generally takes that title. All right, so David's observation, that's in maybe 1000 BC. And then you have Diagoras, like I said, in the 400s. But I wouldn't even classify him as a typical atheist. And then you have Epicurus, I think is the right way to say it. He's in the 200s BC, and we're going to talk about him a little bit more next week. But he put forth, it's come under different names, the Epicurus or Epicurean riddle or the paradox of Epicurus. And his thinking, his philosophy kind of dealt more with the problem of evil. If God is all good and all powerful, why does evil still exist? So like I said, next week we'll deal more with that. Epicurus himself never made any statements about there is no God, not that I can remember. His teachings, however, really fueled the atheistic movement of his time. His idea was that whatever makes you happy, you should do. But when he said that, he wasn't trying to teach hedonism, which is fulfill all of your lusts and do whatever you want. Every bad thing that you want to do, just go ahead and do it. You won't pay for it. Eat, drink, tomorrow we die. That's not what he taught, but that is what came from his teaching. He tried to say that if it makes you feel good, do it. But what makes you feel good is actually helping other people and being a peacemaker and things like that. Now, by no means was he trying to be some sort of prophet and help people in that spiritual, moral type way. He was just giving his philosophy on life, but it really devolved into something very twisted. All right, so he's one of the main figures that you do find when you read about the history of atheism. Now, as time went on, there's obviously more to the story. People come up with various reasons for their unbelief. But then when you get into the 1st and 2nd century AD now, early part of the church age, the Roman Empire, or let's say people within the Roman Empire, were accusing Christians of being atheists. Now, the reason I point that out, obviously we're not atheists, but we as Christians, and let me say those early Christians, denied the Roman gods, the gods of Roman mythology. And because Christians did not accept those Roman gods, Romans then said, you are atheist. You do not believe in these gods. Now, that is not the position of, that is not how we use the term atheist now. So again, you have to take that within its context. But it just shows you, this is, like I said, the overview and how atheism has kind of, evolved over time. Now, after you get 1st, 2nd, 3rd century AD, you have Romans accusing Christians of this atheism. And then the Roman Catholic Church rises to power. There's this gradual shift where the Roman Empire, the political system of Rome, falls. And the religious system of Rome steps up and kind of fills the void. And because they did, they thought it was their duty to suppress, and I put heresy in quotes there, anything they considered heretical, they suppressed it. Now, they suppressed it by saying, if you stand up and teach officially different than we do, and say that we're wrong, then we have every right to put you to death. So this not only was applicable to atheists, right? If somebody stood up and said there is no God, then the Catholic Church would suppress that through various punishments, even death. But this was true even for a Baptist preacher of that time, or regardless of the denomination. If they were to stand up and say, I think the Catholic Church or the Pope is wrong, they got suppressed. All right, so heresy, the reason I've pointed that out is atheism kind of, in these Middle Ages, sometimes called the Dark Ages, people were not allowed to speak their mind openly, and people couldn't write books against the church's official teaching and doctrines. So that's why you don't read much about atheism in that time, but that's not to say that it didn't exist. Same thing when it comes to Bible-believing Christianity. There aren't a lot of historical works from that time from Bible-believing Christians. But that's not to say they weren't there, they just didn't have a voice. And that leads to the next portion of history. You get into about the 13 or 1400s, and the Renaissance starts. That word, I believe, is a French word. I think that's the etymology on it. And it means rebirth. And this was a rebirth or a renewal of interest in the arts, all sorts of arts and academic things. Now this, I'm not saying that the Renaissance led to the Reformation as far as the movement. One movement did not cause the other. But as far as the chronology of it, when you look at what happened first and then a couple hundred years later, you have the Reformation picking up speed and becoming a very prominent thing in history. Now, the Reformation, you might find that a bit strange to find in a list of atheism's history. But let me tell you where I think it played a role. For almost over 1,000 years, the Catholic Church is suppressing anything they consider heresy. But now you have preachers standing up from various denominations saying the Catholic Church is wrong, the Pope is wrong, which is to say the powers that be are wrong. Because in those powerful nations, they're pretty much the Pope had authority there. So now these men are standing up and saying, no, we're not going to allow that man, that Pope, to rule over us. And they found their voice. Now, the Pope did have many of them put to death. But the boldness of these people emboldened other people, non-believers, to also stand up and go, wait a minute, we also don't agree. Now, we don't agree with those Protestants there, but we also don't agree with what the Pope has been doing. We don't agree with the religion. We don't agree with the spiritual stuff. We don't agree with the way that they run their politics. And they found their voice. So atheism then starts to, it's not as if there was a group waiting, going, we just need this chance, and then our church or our sect, our group will finally get it, have a voice. But I think atheists that were sprinkled here and there thought, well, now's the time to start talking about it. So now the door was open. Right about the same time, maybe 100 years later, the Enlightenment really picks up speed. And the Enlightenment, some call it the Age of Reason, if I remember correctly. And there was a big push on we have to have proof, we have to have a rational reason for believing things. We cannot take things by blind faith, which honestly, it wasn't that bad of a thing. I tend to agree with that. We need to have a reason to believe in things. We don't want to just take anybody's word for it. But the Enlightenment also, some people took it a little too far to say, well, unless we have scientific, verifiable, repeatable, observable proof of that thing right here, they started to ask for a little too much evidence, to be honest. But maybe that's a discussion for another time. But that part of history, the Enlightenment, then leads to about the 1800s. You have Charles Lyell and Charles Darwin and other scientists. They really start to take center stage. And in order to explain why they don't believe in God, right, they have to answer other questions like, well, okay, you don't believe in God, but then how did everything get here? How do you explain creation? How do you explain humanity and the way our bodies operate and are made? I mean, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. How do you explain it? So these scientific hypotheses started to really get emphasized, and society says, now we have an option. We've always been told, well, God just did it. Now these guys are saying they understand how it all works, so that kind of eliminates the need for God. At least some people saw it that way. So with science kind of driving the movement, now atheism is really picking up speed. And then in the last century, the 20th century, and even up until now, I would think that atheism has kind of gotten more organized and has become an organized sect or cult, if you will, by itself. Now, I realize I put a book together that talks about denominational differences. You expect to be reading about different religions. And why then would we include atheism in a book about religions? But as we go through the various topics for this group, I hope that you'll see they operate very much like any other religious sect. For over 1,000 years, I won't say the then known world, but the European side of the world where the Pope had rule, he said, you have to believe whatever my black robe priests tell you. They're right. They're educated. They've studied it. Now just take their word for it. For over 1,000 years, that's how it went. But now, right, people have lost faith in those black robe priests that studied and studied theology, put their nose in the books and tried to figure out those tough answers. Now atheism says just trust whatever those white lab coat scientists say. And listen, they're studied, they're learned, they know what they're talking about. Don't question it, just believe whatever they tell you. And they operate very much like other religious sects do. I even mentioned in the book, you can go online and find the first Church of Atheism. And it's not just one. They're popping up, I don't want to say rapidly, but you can find them in several different places. They're in the UK, they're in the US, and I'm assuming many other places as well. They have what we would know as a church service. They have that. They sing songs, they have time to socialize. announcements. They have humanitarian efforts. They organize their efforts to go out and help the community. And then they have sermons. They actually have somebody preach to them. And it's very humanistic, right? It's not as if they spend all of their time talking about why you shouldn't believe in God, but they talk about loving their neighbors. They talk about helping people and put all the emphasis on humanity. But all right, so that's a brief overview. Let's come now. The topic we're going to discuss tonight is evolution through natural selection. And by no means are we going to cover every possible angle of this. You guys, if you have questions on it, you're welcome to ask. As I said, preacher, not a scientist. So I'm trying to recognize my limits in this, but I'll do the best I can. I'm going to approach this from the standpoint if I'm having a conversation with an atheist and they bring up, well, what about evolution? Hasn't science proven now that we evolved, from a single-celled organism into this very complicated system now that we know as Homo sapien? Isn't that proof that there is no God? So if we're going to have that conversation, these are some of the things that I would probably bring up and try to address. All right, so evolution through natural selection. And to be honest, I'm considering revising the book a little bit on this point, because I think I believe in evolution through natural selection. Just that title. But what I'm about to explain will hopefully make sense of why I say that. There are different versions of evolution. So when I wrote the book and when I put this slide together, evolution through natural selection, that's what you see in the book as one of the titles. I am talking about Darwinism, it's sometimes referred to as that, or Darwinian evolution. Now, the difference here is between the micro and the macro, small and big evolution. Now, microevolution, I believe in. I believe that is a scientific fact. It is something that they have observed, that you can go to a lab and repeat. You can run the process, run the test, and come to that conclusion over and over again. This is simply to say that a particular kind of animal, right, like a dog, a canine, that canine can adapt over time. It will adapt to its environment, and certain biological changes will take place so that it can survive in that environment. So it is built into the nature of that animal, of that living creature, that if it's in a colder environment, then within their DNA, something is going to select, right? Naturally, it will select whatever needs to be selected so that it can survive in that environment. So the next generation as it comes, that DNA is passed on, and adaptations, mutations, that's a slightly different thing, mutations, but those things do happen, they're observable. So I believe in microevolution. So when somebody says, do you believe in evolution? You really need to ask, what kind of evolution are you talking about? If you mean microevolution, that is to say adaptations, yes. But are you talking about macroevolution, which I think is another way of saying Darwinian evolution? And there I would have to take a strong stance and say, no, I don't believe in that at all. Now, might I also just quickly mention that some people have even dug deeper into, well, let's say delved deeper into the micro and macro evolution. They have kind of redefined those terms a little bit, or maybe refined those terms. So even when you're having this conversation, you might have to talk a little longer about what do you mean by micro, what do you mean by macro. To be honest, it's a bit tedious of a conversation, but I'm just letting you know that it is out there. When I say micro, I'm talking adaptation. When I say macro, we're talking about, as I mentioned in the book, a hippo becoming a horse, right? We're talking about the monkey becoming a man. That type of evolution, I don't believe in. Now, if I can just make this comment about science in general, not just evolution, but there is observational science and circumstantial science. Or maybe this is a way to talk about evidence. Maybe that's a better way to put it. But when we're talking about observational science or evidence, we can see it happening, right? We can go to a lab, we can run a test, we can repeat this process over and over and watch the conclusion happen there in front of us. We can see the outcome. Now, that kind of science I can get behind. And that kind of science is fascinating. The world is filled with great advancements, great discoveries through that type of science. But then there's circumstantial. Circumstantial is you come to, let's call it a crime scene, just for the sake of the story. You come to a crime scene and there's a dead body and there's somebody standing near the body holding a gun. Now, you did not see that person with the gun shoot that person that is now on the ground. Had you seen that, that would be observational. But now what you're seeing is the aftermath of some event. And it is a logical conclusion, right? Or let's say a logical assumption to think the person holding the gun, there's a chance, I assume, that person shot the guy on the ground. But the evidence that you see is circumstantial. It depends on the circumstance. So then you have to come in and ask questions, and you can run tests to say, did the bullet in the person come from the bullet in the gun? And the person who's holding the gun, right? Is there any way we can determine whether that person pulled the trigger? You have to get more evidence before you can build the story to say, yep, the guy with the gun shot the person on the ground. Now, evolutionists would like to make you think that the story behind biological evolution and how we went from a one-celled organism to this complicated system that we are now, they would want you to think that it is as simple as that illustration I just gave, that the scientists are walking into a lab or walking onto into an autopsy and checking the body, and it's as simple as there's one person with a gun standing over the dead body, and all we have to do is figure out a couple things and we can determine, yep, this guy did that. But biological evolution through natural selection, the Darwinian version of it, is not that simple. It is very, very complicated to get from single-cell organism to this. And then when you extend that out to try to explain the cosmos, right? Not just human life, but all of physics, all of astrophysics and everything, it's very, very complicated. And even though we can look around at the evidence and how things are intricately put together, we can see how it stands now. But when we're talking about the circumstantial evidence, you're kind of left to the ability of the storyteller. He can take a few pieces of the puzzle and say, now let me fill in the rest of the puzzle so that you get the whole picture. I think you can quickly see whoever's telling the story, right? He's now in control of the narrative, and he can kind of paint this picture. If you just have a few pieces, you can add whatever pieces you want. You can make that picture turn out very differently than the way it was intended. And I think that when we're dealing with Darwinian evolution, they're dealing with circumstantial evidence, and we're left to them telling the story based on their worldview instead of based on what they actually saw happen, right? Eyewitness, firsthand testimony is very, very powerful in these cases, more than just, well, I have a few pieces of the puzzle and here's what I think probably happened. That's a very different thing. All right, so a few necessities for believing Darwinian evolution. Number one, you have to have imagination. And I give you some stuff in the book about Richard Dawkins, the author of The God Delusion and the author of The Greatest Show on Earth, wherein he tries to prove why evolution, Darwinian evolution, is a scientific fact. In that book, he appeals over and over again to thought experiments. He will lay out a few observable facts. You know, we've seen these adaptations. We saw guppies, that change colors to hide themselves from predators. And we've seen birds, their feathers change so that they can find a mate easier and stuff like that. We've seen these adaptations. Now, let your mind travel back 20,000 or 2 million years. Can't you see how if these type of changes constantly happen, can't you see how this bird would turn into this reptile or vice versa, Well, that's a thought experiment. That's imagination. So first, I think you need imagination. Second, you need lots of geological time. Without an old Earth, Darwinian evolution is completely untenable. It's impossible. You have to have not thousands, not hundreds of thousands, millions and millions of years. So we'll talk more about that in a moment. And then you have to eliminate the missing links. And this has to do with the fossil record, of course. And we will expound a little bit more on that in just a moment. But with the missing links, make sure you see there it's plural. Okay, it's plural. For years when I was growing up, they used to talk about the missing link. That's how I heard it when I was in school. Maybe I misheard, but I'm pretty sure that's what the teacher was telling us, is we just need to find the missing link. And the way it was explained to me back then was between monkey and man, we just need to find the fossil evidence that shows the intermediate between monkey and man. And the problem is that's not the only intermediate or missing link there is. There are potentially thousands of missing links, if not more, but we'll talk about that just now. Let's talk a little bit more about each one of these things. First of all, let's talk about imagination. Macroevolution has never been observed. This is not my opinion. Scientists will admit this. They have not seen. It's not as if any scientist in his lifetime has seen the hippo turn into a horse, or the dog into a cat, or however you want the story to play out. They have not seen one taxonomical family, that is canine, turn into feline. Right? No one has seen that happen. It only exists in thought experiments. So as the way Dawkins put it in his book, he used that hairpin turn. So you take the family tree idea. So you have some branches going out. And you have this animal over here and this animal over here. And Dawkins used a rabbit and a leopard. And he said, you trace their heritage back far enough and you will come to where those two lines meet, where the rabbit and the leopard meet. And he said, it might be called a rapipart or something like that. And he said, of every biological line has this hairpin turn where we meet somewhere. We all are linked. Humans and snails, somewhere along the line, we're going to meet up. Well, no one's ever observed that. That exists in books. It exists in charts. We've all seen that chart, of the monkey crawling on the ground. And then a slow progression where eventually you have a man walking upright. We've all seen that. But no one's ever observed that in real life. That's an artist's rendition, right? That's something they put in science books. That's just to illustrate what scientists think happened. No one's ever seen that. All right, so you need imagination. Second thing, we are essentially being asked to trust the storytelling abilities of those doing the research. Now, I admit that the story that they're telling is, they're starting with the observations they made in their laboratories or the ones they made out in nature. I get it. I'm not saying that everything that they put forth is false. It's not as if scientists are purposely trying to deceive people. I think they do start with facts, but then their view of the world, they've already decided there is no God. Because there is no God, I have to explain how everything got here. So let me put together a story that will support the conclusion I've already come to. And I think that's where the danger comes in. And I've given our option here. Our option is to believe what the prophets revealed. I'm talking Moses, David, Isaiah, and so forth. So here's I think the two sides of it. You have a scientist in a lab. He runs some tests and he comes to some conclusions. He says, here's what I know about this rock. Here's what I know about human biology, about the anatomy. I've seen these various adaptations. Here's what I definitely know. Now, I've got 50 pieces of the puzzle. But how many pieces are supposed to be in that puzzle? Are there only 100 pieces to the puzzle? Because if you have 50 out of 100, well, you might be able to figure out what the rest of it should look like. But let's say you have 50 pieces of a 5 million piece puzzle. Well, you hardly know what this is supposed to look like. So now you're going to have to fill in all the gaps, and man, you better be one great storyteller. Because you're starting with just a few things, very few things, And now you're trying to tell me that based on these few things I know, this is how the rest of the story goes. That takes a lot of faith. A lot of faith. And the thing about the scientific community, I appreciate their honesty in this. They say we're always learning. And what they mean by that is we're figuring out that what we knew 20, 30 years ago is now either wrong or irrelevant. Now we've found out that that is not how this actually works. It's actually like this. There's many areas in which this is true. Even Darwin, Charles Darwin, the way he explained biological evolution, I don't know of any evolutionist now that holds to the same positions in every way that Darwin did. They've proven several things of his original hypotheses. They've proved those things wrong. So science continually evolves. Well, that being said, if they're always learning and figuring out, oops, we were wrong, do I really want to build my house on that shifting sand? I'm not sure. Now, what about what the prophets have revealed? You say they don't have scientific evidence. Well, they have evidence. And I think it might work for science, because here's the thing. They said, God told me. You know what the community around them said? How do we know God's talking through you? Prove it. And then verifiable, visible things took place. I'm thinking specifically with Moses. Moses said, God, they're not going to believe that you sent me. God said, yep, you're right. Here's some signs. Do these things. Prove it to them. Give them something tangible, physical, visible, verifiable. Validate what the claim is. So is there a reason for us to trust what Moses, David, Isaiah, and these other prophets have said? Well, as time has gone on, we have seen their prophecies come to pass, not once or twice, not 10 or 20 times, but hundreds of times. Biblical prophecies have come to pass exactly the way these prophets explained. So I'm pretty comfortable to say if I find something biblically, biblically revealed or revealed in the Bible, I'm very comfortable to trust what these prophets are saying. All right, so that's a few words on the imagination part of it. Now, let me say real quick, imagination, an old earth, and the fossil record. You have to have those three things to believe in Darwinian evolution, and these three things overlap. It's not as if you have to start with imagination, okay? You can start with any one of these three, I think, but in the end, you have to have these three things working together. Furthermore, I don't think these are the only three things, okay? Please do not think that if you're going to be an atheist, you have to, these are the only three things you have to figure out. I'm just saying these three things at least they're going to be in that atheistic thinking as it pertains to evolution. Sorry. All right, now the age of the earth. Forgive me, this might be a very cheesy title, The Tale of the Two Charleses. I don't know if I've spelled Charleses correctly. I don't think I've ever seen that word in the plural. But there are two men named Charles that you should be aware of. And the first one is Charles Lyell. Now, he was a predecessor to Darwin. He was about, I think, 20 or 30 years older than Darwin, something like that. But in the early part of the 1800s, Charles Lyell stood up against what I believe in his day was called catastrophism. I think that's the way to pronounce it. Catastrophism, maybe. I'm not sure which way to say that. But Lyell, he put forth this idea of geological evolution that took time, lots and lots of time. Before Lyell, the common scientific thought was there have been multiple catastrophes, and it's not that everybody believed in God creating the world in 6 days. Not all of these people were young earth creationists, right? Many of the scientists of that time were old earth believers. But they believed in many catastrophes that would make dating, like rocks, testing the rocks, it would make that very, very difficult. Lyell came along and said, I don't think so. There's been this steady state. And as you see on the screen, uniformitarianism, that things have continued as they were since the beginning. So even though there are these, let's say great I want to say weather events, meteorological, would that be the right word? There have been storms and tornadoes and those type of things, but nothing that would disrupt the testing. We can still test the rocks and test the sand and test the water, test the ice caps, all of that stuff. And we can figure out the age of the earth through those things. Now, interestingly enough, the Apostle Peter, let me give you the verse here. This is exactly what the Apostle Peter said was going to happen. In 2 Peter 3, verse 3, knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. Two things you want to notice in that. All things continue as they were. So they would believe in this steady state, uniformitarianism type of thing. And furthermore, they would believe that there was a creation, the beginning of the creation. Now, I don't know of any evolutionist that denies the universe had a beginning. Now, they don't believe in a creator, but they believe that all matter at one point came into existence. And of course, they would believe that through the Big Bang. But for many centuries, scientists believed that society believed that the universe was eternal. So Peter has a very impressive prophecy here to say in the last days, people are going to doubt that Jesus is coming back. And why is that? Because they're going to say nothing's changed since the beginning. That's what they're saying. What do they not factor in? Verse 5, for this they willingly are ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. They don't take into account Noah's flood, which is a massive point when we're discussing the age of the earth. All right, so you have Lyell pushing this geological evolution, and now instead of just a few thousand years, or even a few million years, he's stretching this out. There could be maybe billion. And I think, I checked today, what it told me today is that the earth is 4.5 billion years old. I think that'll probably vary from one textbook to the next. But I've heard from 4.5, I've heard some people say 5 billion years. Guys, that number is really hard to fathom. I mean, I know we kind of take it for granted. We just hear these numbers and go, okay, 5 billion. But when you try to think of anything as being 5 billion, I mean, if you had 5 billion Rand, you wouldn't even know how to count that much. How do you spend that much money? To say there's been 5 billion years, that's a tough thing to prove. All right, now, Darwin, once he read and heard what Lyell was teaching, he thought maybe, just maybe, this same thing is applicable in biology. And then he thought, well, now that there's this much time and things, the strata in the earth, Lyell said, over time, the earth and just kind of lays these strata down, and we can go back and just count the rings in the trees and count the strata in the rocks, and then we can come to these conclusions. And Darwin thought maybe we can do the same type of thing with biology. So without Charles Lyell, you really don't have Charles Darwin, because Lyell offered this idea of a long period of time leading up to our present day, which would make it would give enough space for things to change. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about are the dating systems reliable, right? We start talking about the age of the earth. How do we date the rocks? How do we date the ice caps? And guys, again, my limitations. That's not my area of expertise. I have a book here. This guy's name is Jonathan Sarfati, and he works with Creation Ministries, I believe. And this book is called The Greatest Hoax on Earth, Refuting Dawkins on Evolution. So as I mentioned earlier, Dawkins wrote that book, The Greatest Show on Earth, and trying to prove evolution. And then Sarfati wrote this in response to that. This is the other side of the story. Now, that other book, if I'm not mistaken, becomes a New York Times bestseller, but who's going to carry this at exclusive books? You're not going to find it there. So I would encourage you, if you want to read up more from an expert on these things, grab a hold of one of these kind of books. Go to creation.com. I think you'll find some of Sarfati's information on there, but he does a great job dealing with each thing that Dawkins brings up and what many geologists might bring up. But are the dating systems reliable? Now, let me just read you a couple things from Sarfati's book, and then I have a quote as well I want to give you from a website that I read up on today. But let me just give you the introductory remarks here. Darwin's ideas of gradual change in biology over eons were an extension of Lyell's ideas of gradual change in geology over eons. Without long ages, evolution is not possible. So for Dawkins, it is also imperative to demonstrate long ages. All radioisotope dating methods first need to postulate a history, and that involves at least 3 assumptions. A reliable eyewitness, however, trumps such assumptions. So again, they have to assume things before they can begin their research. And what do they assume? They assume the steady state, that there's no reason for us to doubt, or there's no reason to think that there's some catastrophe that took place that would throw off the dating system. So they have to assume it's all been nice and steady. He goes on to say, Dawkins explains radiometric dating, but seems unaware of the weakness of its assumptions. There is evidence that half-lives were vastly accelerated at some time in the past. Moreover, radioactive clocks are not always zeroed. Now, this will be very important. When we talk about dating the rocks and the ice caps and things like that, tree rings, how do we know that the clock started at 0? Because in order to run a proper test to find out the age of something, somebody needs to have been there in the beginning and tested it to say, okay, I was there when this thing came into existence, and when I tested it, it tested at 0. And now I test it, and it gives me a different number. Then we can get from this to that. But without that starting position, you don't know exactly how high the count should go, or what the count should be, rather. He goes on to say, also, the presence of C14, or carbon-14, in billion-year-old diamonds shows that they can't be more than about 100,000 years old. And I put billion-year-old in quotation marks because people will say diamonds are that old. But then there's carbon-14 in them. Carbon-14 shouldn't be able to last beyond maybe 50,000 years. Well, then how do you find it in diamonds? If a diamond is a billion years old, as they tell us, it should have no carbon-14, but they do. So evidently the tests are not as reliable as they want us to think. It is common for radiometric dates to be ignored or explained away when they disagree with accepted ages, which is fascinating. Let me give you this quote as it pertains to carbon-14. And there are other ways, right? Carbon-14 can only go back about 50,000 years. Geologists use other dating methods, argon and potassium, is it potassium? I think it's argon potassium, that they can test that, and that goes, back millions and millions of years, evidently. So they say. Sarfati deals with that in the book and shows how that's not reliable either. Let's see if I can just quickly give you that other comment about the carbon-14. Yeah, here we go. So this is a scientist, probably a geologist. One of their experts admit this. He says, if a carbon-14 date supports our theories, we put it in the main text of a book or a report. If it does not entirely contradict them, we put it in a footnote. And if it is completely out of date, right, it doesn't match what we thought it should, we just drop it. Now there's the expert admitting we don't actually examine or give you all of the evidence to examine. So are the dating systems reliable? Well, without knowing what that substance started at, as far as this geological clock, it's impossible to date it properly. Sarfati uses the example in the book of filling up a beaker, like in a science lab, with water. And he says, now I'm going to fill it up to 300 milliliters, and it's going to fill up 5 milliliters per minute. And he says, now class, how long will how long will this beaker take to fill up? And then you just do the quick math. That's how long it takes. He says, but there are some things you didn't know. The beaker already had 100 ml water in it. And the other thing you didn't know is that the beaker has a leak. So even though I'm putting 5 ml in every so often, at this rate, some of it is leaking out. He said, you don't have all the facts. So there's no way you can trust that conclusion. Well, it's the same thing with creation. When you look around at the rocks and things, you don't know how long, or what the age of it was, rather, when it was actually made. And that's the last point I make on this point here. The last thing I want to say about this point. God made things with built-in age. When God made Adam, he didn't make Adam as a little baby. He made him as a full-grown man. Now, if there would have been a doctor there to take a, DNA test and find out what Adam's age was, technically he's 1 day old, right? On day 6 of creation, Adam is 1 day old. Well, not even that. He's 1 minute old if he's just been made. But I don't think he would have tested as 1 minute old. Certainly not the way we know a baby as 1 minute old, right? Or a human being at 1 minute old. So Adam would have tested as, who knows, a 30-year-old man or something. So there was age built into Adam when he came into existence. And this is, I think, going to be true for all of God's creation. He made, people have used this question for years. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? And that's a fancy way of saying evolution or creation. Right? The chicken, that's evolution. The egg, the chicken, that's creation. And the egg, that's evolution. Did we start from the bottom and then go up? Right? That's starting one cell organism and then turn into this complicated system. Or do we start at the top, God creates it fully made, and then we start with God and it comes down to us, these smaller, less complicated systems, less complicated than God. And I think biblically we know the chicken came first. All right, so that's the age of the earth. I wanted to give you this quote about carbon-14. I went to this website, nature.com. The title of the article was Carbon Dating, the Archaeological Workhorse. I put workhouse, I'm sorry, it should be workhorse, is getting a major reboot. And this is what they had to say. Now, I'm picking this up mid-article, right? So they've been talking about dating certain things. He says, but this basic calculation assumes that the amount of carbon-14 in the environment has been constant in time and space, which it hasn't. Now that's interesting. This website is not pro-creation, okay? They're not trying to prove a young Earth by any means. They're just showing that carbon dating, the way it's been done up until now, is not completely reliable. And that's why it needs a reboot. Well, that's kind of a big deal. In recent decades, reading further, the burning of fossil fuel and test of nuclear bombs have radically altered the amount of carbon-14 in the air, and there are non-anthropogenic wobbles going much further back. So there have been catastrophes. During planetary magnet field reversals, for example, more solar radiation enters the atmosphere, producing more carbon-14. The oceans also suck up carbon, a little more so in the southern hemisphere where there's more ocean, and circulate it for centuries, further complicating things. Well, they're admitting that there's a lot more to the story than just grab the rock, run one test, and then grab that same piece of rock a few years later, or take a rock from that same area a few years later, test it again, and go, okay, we tested it here, we tested it there, and we've noticed, the age of it is differed by this much. So that means we'll extrapolate it backwards and go, yep, steady state. The little change that we saw here, it must have been going on for millions and millions of years. So they assume quite a bit of things. They're not taking into account things like Noah's flood. That would have greatly changed the way you would date the rocks and the carbon that's in them and all the argon, all of that stuff would have changed. And I make mention of Mount St. Helens in the book. That was a fascinating time for scientists because when Mount St. Helens erupted, that volcano erupted in Washington State, They then were able to go see what a geological catastrophe could do in just a few short minutes. Rock strata was formed in just a few minutes. Scientists before that thought it would take millions of years for these strata to form in rock. And it took only a few minutes of that volcano erupting to produce that same strata. So the scientific community would really need to rethink the way that they date the rocks. Okay, and then one last thing we're going to talk about here, the missing links. The fossil record is not complete. It is not complete. To say that we have so much evidence, we found so many fossils, yes, that's true, I guess, but that's a little subjective. Because again, how many pieces are supposed to be in this puzzle? When you say we have so much of the fossil record filled in, do you? How do you know where the stopping point is? How many fossils are there to actually find? Because maybe what we think is a lot, now I don't know how many fossils have been logged up until this point, how many they've unearthed, but to think that we have the majority of biological life recorded in the fossil record, I think that would be nonsensical. I don't think anybody would claim that. The fossil record is far from complete. And I've also mentioned the fossil record lends itself to private interpretation. It cannot tell its own story. It cannot tell the complete story. Much of the story must be filled in by the observer. So you can take the fossil record, and people do this. A creationist will look at it and go, yep, the fossil record came to be because during Noah's flood, animals were racing up mountains and various places trying to get to higher ground to escape the water. And that's the reason we see animals and organisms in the fossil record the way we do. And then the evolutionists will look at that same fossil record and go, yep, that shows that this organism came first, and then eventually it turned into this one, and then eventually that one, and so forth. Now, there are a few things, right, you can look at in the fossil record, I think that would incline you one way or the other. And if the evolutionist is right, then you should never find a more advanced biological form in a lower strata or, in a lower position. It wouldn't be possible. So there are cases like that. There are cases of more highly developed animals in a lower position. That should not be the case. Now, as a Bible-believing creationist, when I look at the fossil record, right, and I say, okay, I see this animal, and then I see this animal, and then I see this, or the bones of these animals, the few pieces that are left. I look at that, you know what I think? I go, yep, God made that one, and God made that one, and God made that one. And he made them a little different. It fits. The things that we can observe actually going on in the world, right? It matches what we have in the book of Genesis. Genesis says that animals and trees and fruit trees and so they bring forth fruit after their kind. That's what we observe happening in the world today. Humans bring forth humans. Dogs bring forth dogs. Apple trees give apples and produce more apple trees. That's observable scientific evidence. It's happening the way the Bible says that it should happen, the way that God set it up. So when I look at the fossil record, if I already have concluded this Darwinian evolution, then I'm going to allow that worldview to paint in the gaps, the missing parts of the fossil record. And I go, okay, this is a small little organism, and then there's a slightly bigger one. This one, grew wings, and this one has a beak. And then I'm going to start to look at those and go, yep, in between this set of bones and that set of bones, there must have been 200 million years. And that's what gave this little thing time to turn into this thing. And then, okay, there's another big jump. We're missing some intermediates, but that just means that there must have been 500 million years. And I'm going to let my worldview kind of tell the story. And that's not fair. Because fossils, all that they're proving is that those organisms once were on the earth and they were fossilized. That's as much as it proves. I don't think the fossil record by itself proves the biblical version of creation. I think it is consistent with the story we have from creation and from Noah's flood. I don't see anything about the fossil record that goes against what we have in the Bible. But I certainly wouldn't turn to the fossil record and go, yep, that's evidence that creation and Noah's flood actually happened. I just think it's consistent. But if you are an evolutionist, those links, they have to be in the perfect order. Now, when you consider a flood, right, when you consider catastrophes, we would expect to see a few things out of order. The fact that that you do find a nice sequence going, let's say, up the mountain. Again, there's a reason that you would find certain smaller bones below, certain bigger bones in different places. There are reasons why that might have been. But for the evolutionist, you can't have that out of order. So that's why the missing link or links, that's something that they have to have that as part of their story. All right, so guys, I've done the best I can tonight. Whenever I'm having this conversation with somebody, I think it actually goes a lot better because I can hear their position on it and what they thought, what they think, and how they interpret the evidence, and then we can go back and forth, and it's a lot easier than just trying to put all this out there all at once. So if you guys have any questions, please feel free to shoot them this way. If you want to send them to me privately, more than welcome. As I've said before, not a scientist, just a preacher. So I've tried to put forth as much information as I can in this short lesson tonight. I do strongly encourage you, though, if you're interested, do your own reading on this. And don't limit it to just books by creationists or by preachers. Expand your reach a little bit. Don't be afraid to read books by men like Dawkins and others, because it's going to help raise the right questions in your mind to go, okay, now how would I respond to that? And I think it will really further your search for truth. All right, so guys, I'm giving you just a moment here, as I always do, to put a comment in or a question. In the meantime, I'm going to pray, and then we'll close the class tonight. Father, thank you for your help. Oh, God, I feel kind of out of place, Lord. This is not the kind of stuff I'm comfortable talking about. God, I think there's so many other people that could do a better job of this. But Lord, that being said, did the best I could. And I ask you to bless my efforts tonight. And I do pray that you would help these students as they continue to look into this and have these conversations, that, Lord, you would guide us in how to explain things to people. And, Lord, at the end of the day, we trust the revelation that you gave. Lord Jesus, you said that God created Adam and Eve. And, Lord, just those words coming from your mouth, that's enough to convince me. I trust what you said. Lord, I pray that you'd continue to help us to grow in our knowledge, not just of you, but of these type of things, so that we can minister to others around us. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right, guys, I don't see any other questions popping through or any other comments. So you guys have a wonderful night. Lord willing, you'll see me tomorrow.